But to get us started, I'm really delighted to be here to introduce the people who will lead us in our next discussion on presidential leadership and U.S. foreign policy. And to kind of get us in the mood, I thought I would take two quotes, and I'll see if anyone knows who these quotes are from. The first quote is, "As to the presidency, the two happiest days of my life were those of my entrance upon the office and my surrender of it." Who said that? Anyone has any idea? No? Martin Van Buren. Okay. The next. No man, and unfortunately it's still no man, will ever carry out of the presidency the reputation which carried him into it. Got that one? Who said that? No guess? Thomas Jefferson. So we're not as knowledgeable as we think about the presidency, but these men are, and so I'll turn it over to them. We have with us for this discussion Tom DeFrank, contributing editor of the National Journal. We have Evan Thomas, journalist, historian, and author of Being Nixon, A Man Divided. And our moderator will be Talmage Boston, attorney and author of a book we have here ready for you to purchase with his signing, Cross-Examining History. We also hope to be joined by Michael Duffy, deputy managing editor of Time, and we'll usher him in when he comes in. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to my esteemed moderator here, Talmage Boston.
Thank you. Okay, what a great honor it is to be here, and fearless leader Bill Clifford, in giving us an email a couple of weeks ago on what he hoped would be the essence of our discussion, said he wanted us to look forward on the subject of presidential leadership and foreign policy while delving into presidential history and great decisions of the past. So I wanted you to understand kind of our ground rules for where we want this conversation to go. And so if we're going to start about looking forward, we obviously are going to be thinking about our President-elect Donald Trump. I realize there is a fair amount of unclarity about what we can expect for the foreign policy of President-elect Trump. So I've asked Tom DeFrank to give us what he perceives to rip away the campaign rhetoric. What do you think the 2 or 3 most important parts of Donald Trump's presidency will be?
Well, I think the primary one has not much to do with programmatic changes, but it's a tonal change. I think Trump's main focus is to try to create a more robust foreign policy. He is convinced, and you heard him all through the campaign saying he thought President Obama had been way too weak and indecisive, and that Obama, in Trump's view, has sent mixed signals to the world, mixed messages, and Trump wants to fix what he thinks is a serious problem. History will decide whether it was or it wasn't. But that's, I think, is the main thing he wants to do. He's talked about having a more stable relationship with the Russians. He clearly wants to renegotiate trade deals, especially with NAFTA and the Chinese. He thinks the Chinese have been picking America's pockets on trade to our disadvantage, and he wants to fix that. I think whether this is one of his main purposes or not, it needs to be. He has to figure out a way to reassure the world that he and his administration knows what it's doing on foreign policy. He, as everybody knows, he has no military experience, no government experience. He's got business and executive experience, but he's not a geopolitician. Now, that's not necessarily critical. Ronald Reagan had a degree in economics, but he wasn't perceived as being much of the sharpest blade in the drawer. But his 8 years as president, I think, were very effective. And one of the reasons for that is he sensed the mood of the country, and he surrounded himself with people like Jim Baker and Mike Deaver and Dick Darman, who were smarter than he was. And Reagan had the inner security to be able to handle that. But it's really important for Trump to get off on the right foot with the rest of the world by reassuring them that he has a vision, and it's a vision that will work, and we will have to see. I want to do a quick flashback to August the 9th, 1974, the day Richard Nixon resigned and Gerald Ford took the oath of office as the 38th president. I was a 29-year-old Newsweek correspondent standing in the back corner of the East Room when Gerald Ford took the oath as the 38th president, and history has already decided that the operative line in that inaugural address was, "My fellow Americans, our long national nightmare is over." I'll leave it to your political points of view to decide whether we just had another long national nightmare end or whether a new national nightmare is going to begin. I'm agnostic at the moment. But what people don't remember is what Ford did for most of his first half day in office. From the moment he was sworn in to the time he went to bed, he had 8 separate meetings with foreign ambassadors. He started off with let me do my list here, I can't remember all of them in order. He spent over 5 hours with the diplomatic corps in the East Room, not in the East Room, in the Roosevelt Room at the White House. He started with the NATO ambassadors, symbolically important. Then he had a single meeting with the Japanese ambassador. Then he had a private meeting with the Soviet charge. Then he met Middle East ambassadors in a group. And I was in the pool on that one, and I remember him saying something like, the only thing that's changed is a change in presidents. And then he met privately with the Chinese rep from the People's Republic of China. We didn't have formal relations yet. Then he met with the Latin American ambassadors in a group. Then he met privately with the ambassador from Israel. And then finally he met with the South Vietnamese ambassador. So in addition to meeting with aides and his new chief of staff and Don Rumsfeld and Al Haig, his outgoing chief of staff, he spent most of the time that day trying to reassure the world that, yeah, we had had a peaceful transition of power, not as not like this last peaceful change of power, but that nothing had really changed. American foreign policy was going to go forward more or less intact. And one of the last things he did that day was decide that a state dinner with King Hussein of Jordan scheduled for the next Friday, August the 16th, would go ahead as scheduled. Nixon had set it up, and Ford said, I don't want to suggest anything, I don't want to do anything that suggests a U-turn. It's important to have continuity and to have the rest of the world think that things haven't really changed, even though they have. So that's important for Trump to do. Let's see whether he thinks that's important and how he proceeds with that piece of it.
Evan, what do you want to add to that in terms of what you think Trump's foreign policy will be?
Well, continuity is the word to focus on for the moment, because in theory, Donald Trump changes everything. I mean, he ran on America first. That is, he ran on an explicit repudiation of the post-war order that we've all known, that we all grew up with. From 1945 to the present, the world order was essentially globalist, free trade, alliance system, with the United States leading the way. That was the world order through Vietnam, through thick and thin. And Trump campaigned on saying, I'm going to change that. I don't care so much about allies. They're going to have to pay their way. I'm not a globalist. I want to come home America. I want to have protectionist policies. I mean, a complete repudiation of everything that you in this room grew up with, in theory.
Campaign rhetoric.
That's the question. Is it campaign rhetoric or not? But continuity is the important word here, because I was thinking as Tommy talked about Gerald Ford, I wrote a book about Nixon, and it just occurred to me that Nixon thought when he appointed Ford as his vice president, it was a kind of insurance policy that they would not want to have Ford in there because he didn't know anything about foreign policy. He totally miscalculated. Congress liked Ford because he was one of their own, and they weren't that worried about his lack of foreign policy knowledge. So Nixon, among the things he called wrong at the end, was that one. And it's important because odd to think of Nixon as a snob, but to Nixon as a foreign policy snob, Ford looks like just some Midwestern congressman who knows about appropriating money for bridges but nothing else. That wasn't really true. But more to the point, Ford inherited a system that had a lot of built-in strength, checks and balances, and Trump is inheriting a system that has a big bureaucracy, which he talks about draining the swamp. Well, the swamp's not so easy to drain. And there are a lot of people at the Pentagon and the State Department and the intelligence community who are going to want to keep things going pretty much as they're going now. And so that's the test. I mean, is Trump serious about his campaign rhetoric? Does he want to truly change all that? Can he change all that even if he wants to? Very much in doubt. I'm putting my money on continuity. For no other reason than Trump, for all of his bluster, wants to be successful. He wants to be he wants to be a winner. He wants to be successful. And I think deep down in his heart, he knows if he rips up everything and tries to start all over, that's a disaster, potentially really dangerous disaster, so that that will chasten him. Now, what happens when world events get rocky, as they always do, and how he reacts to that, I'm really unsure there. But I think his basic instinct is not to follow his own rhetoric. It's to do things more carefully than he suggests.
Well, the world is rocky, the world is dangerous, and whenever we talk about post-World War II foreign policy, ultimately the elephant in the room is whether or when to use nuclear weapons and when to threaten to use nuclear weapons, particularly his campaign promises to, quote, wipe out ISIS, however that might happen. So, Evan, in your book, being Nixon, you talked about how one of his strategies was he wanted the world to believe that he was a madman. Yeah. The madman theory that you never knew when he might punch the button and use nuclear warfare and manipulate fear. But in your book on Eisenhower, Ike's Bluff never presented himself as a madman, but was definitely manipulating fear and bluffing with the use of nuclear weapons. And so in 2016, and the 4 years from now, do we think that this manipulation of fear is still going to be part of the dialogue in trying to make the world a safer place under President Trump?
Well, the thing that leaps to my mind is cyber war, because we are in a whole new, the thing that framed our childhood, and I'm older than most of you here, but I grew up in the 50s, was nuclear war, the fear of nuclear war, and nuclear deterrence. We had whole think tanks, theories of nuclear deterrence, and that still has some relevance. But cyber deterrence is a bigger thing now, because we now know that Russia and China have the capacity, if they wish, to turn off our lights here and all over the country. They have the capacity to destroy our financial system like that. Now, the reason why they're not doing that is because I think they're afraid that we would do the same to them. So it's the principles of deterrence are still kicking around, but they're not as clearly articulated as they were with nuclear. I'm sort of surprised we haven't read more about this in the newspapers, theories of deterrence and what they would do, because both sides are spying on each other, but there aren't that many active measures. I mean, North Korea took down Sony. That's an active measure, but that's a little tiny country against a company. No nation state has taken down or attempted to take it down another, but they made it clear they have the capacity to do it. And the Russians have used what they call active measures. I mean, they hacked the DNC email accounts and gave it to WikiLeaks. That's a pretty active measure to disrupt American democracy. That's, and a lot of people feel, hey, we didn't do anything. We said, hey, don't do that. In fact, I read in the paper today, or yesterday, I guess it was David Ignatius had a column, that we use the hotline to tell the Russians before the campaign, use the hotline to tell the Russians, do not mess with our voting machines. And whether they got that message or not, I mean, they didn't. Apparently they didn't. Mm-hmm. So there's often stuff going on beneath the surface. But I think that's where the game is cyber deterrence, cyber use, cyber political covert action, and it's a new game. I mean, not only is Trump in a new realm about foreign policy writ large, globalism versus come home, but the chief weapon, nuclear weapons, although that's still there and still highly relevant, really it's become more of a cyber game. Now, of course, nukes fit into that because one way you deter a cyber attack is by threatening a nuclear attack. That hasn't been articulated, but maybe that's
We've never
implicit.
had a president like Trump before either.
Right.
Right. Well, I don't think there's going to be a nuclear exchange. I mean, since the 50s, one of the underpinnings of diplomacy with the superpowers is mutual assured destruction. Everybody knows that if they decide to go after the strategic command at Omaha at Offutt Air Force Base, we'll launch on them, and there won't be much of our two countries left. And I don't think,
Or the world.
I don't think madmen, or the world, right? So that is madness. So I don't think that's going to happen. But the fact that both sides have all these weapons is a deterrent. But cyber is critical now. And I would love to know, and I suspect at some point we will know, what President Obama told President-elect Trump last week about the state of cyber warfare on the part of the Russians. It'll be interesting to see just how. I mean, he's going to have a meeting with Putin. Let's just see how that all sorts out, because I suspect Trump now knows a lot more about mischief in the world, much of it coming from the Russians, than he did 3 weeks ago.
I have a scenario which, to answer your nuclear question, a more specific scenario that makes me anxious. I think initially Trump and Putin are going to make nice. I mean, they've said as much. Trump has been saying this all along, Putin's saying it too. So initially there's going to be, look, can't we get along here on Syria and other things? But my fear is that honeymoon will go on for a little while, and then Putin will feel the need to test Trump. And he'll soften him up, and then he'll feel the need to test him. What seems to drive Putin is he likes to distract from problems in Russia with foreign crises, because Russia's got some real problems, that their energy is still in the pits and their economy's tanking. And there's an old Russian formula, stir up trouble on the outside to detract from problems on the inside. But my fear is that Putin will need some distraction. And where will he go? He'll go to the Balkans. And he will do something in Estonia, not the tanks rolling over the border, but manipulating the Russian population within Estonia, as he did in the Ukraine and Crimea, to make trouble with the threat of tanks over the border. Now, what's different about this is not the Ukraine and Crimea. Estonia is a NATO country with a nuclear guarantee. So if shooting breaks out in Estonia between the Russians and NATO countries, that's a nuclear guarantee. You very quickly get to the sword's point on nuclear weapons. And I agree with Tommy. Look, the idea of a full-out end-of-the-world exchange is, thank God, highly unlikely, but it doesn't make me too comfortable to think of superpowers who are in that arena where, in theory, I mean, the one reason why we had nuclear deterrence was because the Russians' tanks could do a lot of damage, and the only way to deter them was with nuclear weapons. That's why we had nuclear deterrence in Europe. And, that is nervous-making to me, the idea of an Estonia crisis where we are, and just to finish this thought, it's not an intentional exchange. It's a mistake. It's a mistake. If both sides go on nuclear alert, which mercifully we haven't really been on in years, but you remember, I mean, a lot of the older folks here, you had 15 minutes, man, that was it. There's a famous meeting in the White House, I wrote about this, 1955, and they're briefing the president, and he realizes if the Russians have ICBMs, he's going to have 15 minutes to decide whether to basically end the world or not. And that was the world in which we lived for a long time. And after the wall fell, they went off that instant alert. They still have the weapons, but they're not on the same alert set. My fear is that if we start fighting in Estonia, we're going to go back on alert, and you have the risk of a mistake.
An early indicator of where this may be going is whether Trump follows through on Obama's plan to rotate some American combat brigades into the Balkans, into Estonia. I think there's some talk about some exercises in Latvia. Putin doesn't like that. He doesn't want that to happen. If Trump lets those rotations go forward, that's a telltale sign of, where Trump is headed. If he pulls back on those, that's another indicator too. I would watch for that in the first 90 days of a Trump administration, whether those troop deployments, there's some talk about sending some tanks back.
Yeah, I thought we actually did that.
We have done that, but there's supposed to be some more. We have done some stuff, right, but there's more to come. Let's see if Trump decides to let those go forward, or as a gesture to Putin, pulls those back. Either way, it'll be controversial.
Yep. Following up in this, where is the world going? On a fast track, Abraham Lincoln once said, "The clash between freedom and tyranny is an issue which can only be tried by war and decided by victory. Looking at today's world chaos where freedom and tyranny often clash, do you agree that in Donald Trump's presidency, the clash must ultimately be tried by war, or do you think that there is hope for diplomatic solutions to bring the temperature down, given that Trump at least has this robust energy as opposed to the Obama pullback?"
The only war that Trump wants is with ISIS. He wants an acceleration of the combat operations against ISIS. He doesn't want a war with Russia. He doesn't want a war in the Middle East, or he doesn't want a war with Syria. But he does want to go after ISIS. So I think, with apologies to perhaps arguably our greatest president, I don't think that formula works any longer.
Evan?
That sounds right to me. He wants to flatten ISIS if he can. ISIS is actually on the run right now. I mean, our run may be too strong a word. ISIS is in retreat. And
They're
it
losing
looks like
territory.
they're losing territory. Now, they could reassemble in other failed states and still cause a severe terror threat to us into Europe, so that doesn't mean they go away. But they are losing, the caliphate is shrinking. And he could accelerate that, but I think that's sort of happening anyways. In terms of war on a larger scale, it's just so unknowable. There are flashpoints, the South China Sea. There are things. It's usually not intentional war. It's a mistake. Somebody makes a mistake and things escalate from
Well,
there.
let's talk about what we do to avoid war. I mean, typically it is tied to whether you have a credibility that push comes to shove, we will take action. We know that President Obama drew a red line in Syria and then refused to enforce it. What was the impact on America's credibility in the world? Jim Falk and I, the last 2 days with Bob Woodward, said he has been perceived as weak throughout the world. So what does Trump do, first 90 days, first year, to cause America to regain its credibility and no longer be viewed as weak as we have been during the Obama presidency?
He's got to say, here's what I'm going to do, and he's got to do it, whatever it is. I agree with you about Obama. I've always thought that while he's going to leave office with higher than 50% approval, far more than Trump or Hillary Clinton, I think he never recovered from not enforcing the red line he drew in the sand. Geopolitically, on domestic policy, I don't think he ever quite recovered from saying, if you like your health care plan, you can keep it. I think both those two things really hurt him. On the other hand, as I said, he's leaving office with 51, 52, 53% approval. Who would have thought?
Yeah. I'm trying to think of the scenario in which Trump says he's going to do something and then does it. That's significant.
That impacts our credibility, that people say, this is a different
Yeah.
president, his walk's going to match his talk?
Yeah. Well, I mean, he's a blowhard and a braggart. I mean, it has been for all his life. He's a deal maker. I mean, to look at this more positively, he calls himself a negotiator. He wrote a book called The Art of the Deal. He sees himself as a deal maker, and that, I hope, would give him some flexibility to not get stuck with lines in the sand. I would personally like him to be more flexible than feeling that he's got to show his manhood by having some line in the sand that can't be crossed. Because we live in a world where crossing those lines, it's not a question just of moving some tanks around. In a nuclear world and in a cyber plus nuclear world, the potential for destruction is so vast and affects the homeland that I'm cautious. I mean, you know, I hope he doesn't feel the need to face off against somebody.
But until he does, what's the status of American credibility?
You know, it's always an issue. This is not a new thing. Let me be slightly pejorative here. Our allies have been whining about American credibility since about 1945. I mean, you know, they were always it was the issue during Vietnam, or at least it was perceived to be.
Yeah, but there's whining and then there's serious doubts about our capacity to follow through.
Yeah, I maybe I'm inured to maybe I'm stuck in the 50s and 60s and I'm not sufficiently, but I've heard these complaints about American credibility for a long time. I don't take them all that seriously. At the end of the day, we are the essential power. Everybody knows it. We have the armed forces, they don't. So I feel less need to show American credibility. I'm not president, I'm just some guy sitting here. But my experience is don't overstate that argument, or my perception of history is don't overdo the credibility thing. In the end of the day, we're still America, we still have the power. You don't have to go around showing it all the time.
On the other hand, I think he's got to do a little something, and I don't know what it is, with NATO, because there are NATO countries that they're a little nervous about Trump's rhetoric. And so he's got to think a little bit about how do I hose down the North Atlantic Alliance without doing something so muscular that my new friend Vladimir Putin gets all irritated. It'll be a tightrope.
I think one thing he can do, and is doing, and is being done, is a lot of intelligence sharing. I mean, this is already a big threat is terrorism. I mean, look at France and ISIS and all that. They are prepared and will do more serious damage to civilian targets. And so there needs to be a ton of intelligence sharing and maybe some covert action. And we can continue to do that. We are doing that, but we could do more of that. And Trump could do more of that.
Now I'm going to ask a hypothetical question. Let's say this stage was a classroom and that Donald Trump was sitting where I am, and both of you wanted to educate him from your perspectives as historians and journalists, the lessons of foreign policy history. What would you say, President-elect Trump, here's what we can learn from the foreign policy of Presidents Bush 43 and Obama? What have we learned from the last 16 years that can impact a more prudent policy going forward?
I'm one of these dinosaurs who thinks reporters should not give advice to the people they cover. I remember once I got in a real problem with Vice President Ford when he asked my opinion of what he should do about something involving Richard Nixon, and he was irritated that Nixon had double-crossed him, and he wanted me to help him get out of this. And I just said,
okay, this question is not about advice. This question is about your perception of history. What are the lessons of history that we learned, foreign policy history, that we learned from the Bush 43 and the Obama presidency that can be used to guide us?
Well, the Obama one is obvious. Evan and I have talked about this already. Don't make a commitment that you're not prepared to carry forward. That was the red line in Syria on Obama. On 43, I would argue that the advice should be surround yourself with a greater breadth and depth of people around you. I mean, history is probably going to conclude that Bush was a little more, not reckless, but he was a little hasty in going to war. And one of the reasons I think history will decide is that he surrounded himself with neocons like Dick Cheney and Scooter Libby and folks like that who to certain degrees had a little bit of their own agenda. Their agenda mostly coincided with his, but not always. And he figured that out, I think, clearly in the second term. So don't be so sure that there are weapons of mass destruction if you're going to start a war on that presumption.
To say what Tommy's just said in a slightly different way, or to boil it down, I think a big test is arrogance. The United States gets itself into trouble when it's arrogant, and has historically. I think 43, possibly because he had some arrogant people around him, like Dick Cheney, allowed himself to be swept away in this idea that we're going to solve the world's problems.
Build nations.
Build nations. You know, he gave a beautiful second inaugural address about the spread of democracy, and it sounded great, but it was a prescription for trouble. It was just taking on more than we could do. I'm a big JFK fan, but that famous inaugural address about bearing every burden, you know, and it's too much. I mean, there's an arrogance and a hubris in that, and the United States gets itself into trouble when we overpromise. In fact, on the drawing the line, my thing would be not just honor the lines that you draw, don't draw lines. Don't do it. I think that we've learned through a painful mistake to try to be more humble, more modest. We have a lot of power. We do.
And there's always moving parts.
And there are a lot of moving parts. You need to surround yourself with a balanced staff of experienced people who can see the traps. Where's Brent Scowcroft? He's 92 years old, but too bad he's not younger. I think he still has all his marbles, but I'd like to have him back. Some guys who could see around the curves like that.
James Baker, 85 years old.
Bring him back. You know, guys who are cautious, smart, clever, see the trouble ahead, and can help keep the decision maker from doing stupid things.
Yeah, you need to have people like a national security advisor who, in Evan's elegant phrase, keep presidents from doing dumb things. You've got to have people with the clout and the stroke, and in the case of a Scowcroft, has an institutional memory and a historical context that I don't see a lot of institutional memory or historical context around the emerging national security apparatus of President-elect Trump. But it's really critical. Actually, I had lunch with Brent Scowcroft a year ago. We have lunch every 4 months, and this was right after his stroke. And he's walking more slowly, but there's nothing wrong with his brain. And we had lunch the day before he endorsed Hillary Clinton, and he didn't tell me he was going to do that. I could have strangled him. But anyway, I said to him at lunch, what is the real problem with somebody like Trump? And he said, you can't overreact. He said, look at the Bay of Pigs, where Evan's written a whole book on this. You ought to read it. But where you get two messages from Khrushchev, and one is belligerent, and one is less belligerent, more conciliatory. Scowcroft Brent was saying you want to have somebody who's more willing to look at the lesser of two evils, or the more hopeful thing here, rather than just say, by God, full speed ahead. And that's why so many foreign policy types that I have spoken with worry about the tweets. Worry about the tweets at 3 in the morning. So we'll see. We'll see how this works out. But you've got to have people around you who know what they're doing, who are not ideologues. The National Security Advisor ideally should be an honest broker. It hasn't always been the case. But mainly you've got to have people around who have that institutional memory and historical context.
I mean, it sounds at this moment like the National Security Advisor may be General Flynn, who is a hard-line anti-Islamist. Seems to be a bit of a hothead. I hope I'm wrong about that, but seems to have an edge and a temper.
You're not wrong.
That's not ideal casting for the National Security Advisor.
And I say that not as a reporter. I say that as a retired Army officer who spent 22 years as an Army officer, active and reserve, and all my time was spent at Army headquarters at the Pentagon. I know a lot about Army generals.
Now, in his presidential memoir, Decision Points, President Bush 43 says that right after 9/11, he quickly engaged our military in Afghanistan, attempting to attack al-Qaeda and the Taliban. And he says the New York Times couldn't wait even a month to tag Afghanistan with the Vietnam label. So Vietnam was over 40 years ago, 50 years ago. How does that still impact our willingness to use our military in trouble spots throughout the world?
Well, I understand how the people would get frustrated with the Vietnam syndrome, that everything's a Vietnam, just the way everything was a Watergate. But I think it's healthy. I think we got ourselves into a mess of trouble and hurt our international credibility by getting into Vietnam without either we should have gone all the way and flattened them, or not at all. But we did this kind of in-between thing that was, got 55,000, 59,000, I guess, young men, mostly men, killed, and didn't do a whole lot. That was hubristic and arrogant, and that ought to be a lesson we learned. Now, we did learn it. Remember the Powell Doctrine? Powell was an officer. Colin Powell was an officer in Vietnam, and when he was at the Pentagon in the 80s, 90s, his doctrine was also known as the Weinberger Doctrine. Before that, overwhelming force, clear exit strategy, clearly defined goals. Only get into fights you're sure to win, and get the hell out fast. Mm-hmm. That was a good doctrine, and we sort of forgot about that when we got into Iraq. The exit strategy part we forgot about. Now Powell bears some of the blame. He was Secretary of State then, and he was kind of sulking in his tent because the power had been taken away by Cheney and Rumsfeld. So Powell is not blameless on that thing, but he had the right instincts from the beginning, and those are my instincts.
For my final question before we turn it over to the audience, I want both of you to weigh in on what you think Donald Trump's going to do with the Iran agreement.
Well, he's going to try to tear it up, but he can't. There are, 5 or 6 other countries who are signatory to the Iran agreement. So he can do some sort of an executive order being tougher, but he cannot, the United States cannot unilaterally just bow out of the Iran deal. How much he can do unilaterally, we'll see, and how much he's willing to do.
I mean, what happens if he does? What happens if he says, we're out, I know we signed this thing, I know it's a binding contract, but that was then and this is now, we're pulling out?
I think nobody else will pull out. This will be another early test, because this is one of his deals. I think what he'll probably end up saying is, I don't want out, I want a better deal, and we can negotiate a better deal. That's what I do. Right. And I've instructed my foreign policy team to engage all of our allies and the Iranians and the Israelis to get a better deal.
Yeah, Tommy's exactly right. I mean, the thing to watch with Trump is that he'll mess around a little bit on the margins and declare victory. This was huge, This was a victory, giant victory, and he will have tweaked, NAFTA or the Iranian deal a little bit. And if you can give him that cover, give him a little bit and allow him to declare victory, we'll all be better off.
Okay, questions from the audience? Yes, ma'am.
Regarding your point about the Powell Doctrine, thank you. Regarding your point a moment ago about the Powell Doctrine and the influence of politics in the military, Vietnam, et cetera, do we see that could be an issue with a President Trump that likes to have his hands in lots of things and likes to play the role out rather than letting the military do their job and either all in or all out? Do you see that politics could influence our military interventions under?
Well, politics always, it should. We have civilian control. we don't want our generals deciding. They're supposed to be straining at the edge of the leash, but the leash is held by civilians. And so I hope politics controls the military. In Trump's case, Trump is a reality TV star and a sometimes successful real estate guy. I mean, who the hell knows?
On the other hand, he has talked a lot about beefing up the military, not cutting back another 50,000 on the Army, expanding the fleet. So I don't know where he gets the money to do that. God bless him if he can, but I think he would be more inclined to have more troops. If you go in, I think he probably would be more of a devotee of the Powell Doctrine than some of the people who were colleagues of General Powell. I'll never forget, I was in Houston 3 years ago talking to a retired Army general who was intimately involved in the planning of Desert Storm. And he told me that there was an annex, one of the 17 annexes to the main operations plan, which talked about we need 50,000 troops to do one thing and one thing only, to secure all the Iraqi army ammunition dumps. Because if you don't do that, the ammo will disappear into the wrong hands. And he said to me, even now, 20 years, whatever it is after Desert Storm, some of the ammunition that we did not secure because we didn't have the troops to do it is still being used in roadside bombs against Americans, even today. And I said to him, well, what happened to that annex? And he said, Rumsfeld and the White House decided that was too many troops, it was politically unwise. I think Trump theoretically would worry less about those sorts of political considerations.
Okay. Yes.
Thank you for speaking before us. I have read, and I've only read this, that Trump has made statements in the past about like NATO and making them pay more and backing out of the Middle East and things like that. Do you know if this is true, if he has said this in the past, and do you see that as guiding him? Because he's certainly backpedaling on a lot of things, some of which is probably a good thing. This
sounds to me like another area that is ripe for a classic Trump deal. I mean, if he can announce that I can see a situation where he comes out and says, I'm proud to stand here with my NATO allies. The alliance has never been stronger. I'm going to make it even stronger, and we've agreed to do a little, he would never use the word tweaking, but if he can get the allies to put up 0.1% more of their GDP or something to help out, that would be great for him. He knows he cannot bust up NATO because Putin is just sitting there hoping against hope that Trump will follow through on that one. I think the whole NATO deal was campaign rhetoric, but I think Trump will feel like he's got to get something to give something, but I think if he gets a little bit, as evidence suggested, kind of in the larger context, he'd be happy to do that. I think there would be a storm in Europe if he really followed through on his threat to cut back seriously. He doesn't want to cut back. He wants them to give a little bit more. And I don't think he's going to be demanding tons, but a little for cover, political covering.
The gentleman in the back there with the beard.
My question is for Evan. Last year I read your book, Being Nixon. I really enjoyed it. One thing that you outlined a lot in the book were a lot of the decisions and thought processes that he had that many of us would probably find to be deeply concerning or unethical. And I was just wondering what comparisons or parallels you might see from Nixon to Donald Trump.
Well, the fear, we don't know, but Nixon had many strengths as a president. I mean, he was a deep strategic thinker. He did go to China. There was a lot to recommend him, things actually that Trump doesn't have. But Nixon was a deep student of foreign policy and with Henry Kissinger executed it. But Nixon was not mentally stable, at least towards the end of his presidency. And I don't know what psychological term to use. The layman's term would be paranoia, although that's probably clinically wrong. But he feared his enemies too much. And that got him into trouble. Trying to punish his enemies was the end of Richard Nixon, as he himself actually recognized as he was leaving the White House. With Trump, the fear is the sort of, this is a layman talking, not an expert, but that he's a narcissist. His self-regard is so great, and his need for reassurance is so great, and his pride and immoral proper is so great that will get him into trouble, that it verges on the pathological, his need to be recognized. All politicians, of course, are narcissists, otherwise they wouldn't be successful politicians. I mean, you have to have delusions of grandeur to run for president. You have to. So I accept that. But there's a limit somewhere. And the fear is that Trump will, it is 3 a.m. tweeting. This is a sign of a guy who's beyond that line, wherever it is. I hope to hell that's not true, but that's the fear.
Well, one common denominator between the Nixon and the Trump personalities is the lack of self-awareness.
Right.
And recognizing one's strengths and one's weaknesses, and so forth. So
It's
that's
a huge issue. And I should say, all of you students from foreign policy, if you haven't done it, buy his book. I'm not just saying this because he's holding the mic, but seriously, that is an incredible study of presidential decision-making. He got to a lot of historians, Jim Baker, some other folks. If you want to learn how it really works, that is the book for you. I mean it.
Thank you, Evan. Yes, ma'am.
I heard on the radio the other day that Donald Trump said that he was going to make Jerusalem the capital of Israel. Now, that's not a negotiable deal. You're either pregnant, you're not pregnant. You're either the capital, you're not the capital. How would you see that playing out if that was indeed a true intention?
Well, he said that during the campaign, and he's repeated it since then. I think he even mentioned it in his acceptance speech, but it hadn't happened, and I think it's just so fraught with foreign policy problems that I think it's going to be difficult for him to pull that off. It's a great line, but it's if it were easy, it would have been done a long time ago. Now, it might be easier for a Republican president to do it. I don't know, but I think. I'd be surprised if he can pull that off.
It's campaign rhetoric for Sheldon Adelson is what that is.
Next question. Yes, sir.
One concern I've had.
Would you stand up, please? Would you
Okay.
stand up, please?
One concern I've had is that nuclear weapons have not been used since 1945, and I just wonder if now that we hear reference to tactical nuclear weapons and so on, is there the possibility that someone might run the risk of a nuclear war, figuring that, well, we can just use the small weapons that really wouldn't hurt anybody very bad? Or how much of a risk is that has been so long and they've been around so long that maybe we're losing sight of the fact of how destructive they can be?
I think it's an interesting question. I don't think our own military establishment is under any illusions about it. They know how terrible nuclear weapons can be, including tactical ones. But there's sort of a larger existential question around the world. Trump has given some encouragement to other nations developing nuclear weapons to defend themselves. And it is concerning that as nuclear weapons proliferate, generations will come along for whom Nagasaki and Hiroshima are very distant memories, and they won't realize the immense horror of these things. Hope that's not true, but you could imagine those scenarios. The idea of a Middle East where everybody's armed with nuclear weapons is not a future we want to contemplate.
I think the greatest real-time threat for nuclear weapons is some terrorist or sold nuclear technology from the Pakistanis or from somebody else, and they use it for a terror weapon. I think that is a danger. It's a real one, but I think that's the only one that has some practical possibility. I wouldn't say likelihood, But I agree with Evan. I don't see a big-time nuclear exchange, and I don't even see a tactical nuclear weapon in the Balkans either.
Well, let's talk about Trump's ongoing commitment throughout the campaign that he's going to, quote, take out ISIS. He never said how. Do either of you have an idea as to a strategy, whether it's using smaller nuclear weapons, given that most of the world is in opposition to ISIS and regards it as dangerous to world order? Evan, I'll go with you first. Is there anything you can think of as if you're president, your goal was to take out ISIS? How does somebody go about that, given that?
I think it's bluster. In fact, as we've talked earlier, ISIS is in retreat. I think we're going to, a Kurd and Iraqi force is going to take Raqqa, the purported capital. I think that's going to happen regardless of what Trump does. That's already happening. He can beef it up a little bit, but I think that's already happening. Most of the real work against ISIS has to happen in the intelligence world, because the threat of ISIS is not the caliphate. The threat is they're going to set up a nuclear weapon in Paris or in Washington, or something, a chemical weapon, a biological weapon. That is an intelligence question, and I hope that one reason to keep NATO going is to have intelligence exchanges. These intelligence services have to be talking to each other and trading information all the time. We've had a great relationship with the Brits for years. In fact, I think I heard it was the Brits who tipped us off that the Russians were into stealing the Democratic Party's. That came from our cooperation with British intelligence. So we really need to cooperate with foreign intelligence services. European, for sure, but also Middle Eastern. Our relations with the Jordanian intelligence service and the Saudis have been extremely useful. Those propping up those kingdoms are some pretty powerful intelligence services, and the CIA is reliant on them for information. So that is where, I think that's where the real battle is fought against ISIS, is at that level, not tanks, not bombs, but intelligence.
I think the only way President Trump takes out ISIS is to send many more thousands of American troops onto the ground, which I think is a non-starter even for him, and or to beef up the drone strikes. A criticism about Trump in the campaign was he doesn't know what he doesn't know. But now he's starting to learn what he didn't know, if in fact he didn't know. I think these briefings, I would just bet you that Trump is really surprised at the magnitude of the drone strikes against ISIS. And I suspect that he will probably want to expand that. But it's not like President Obama has just been sitting around doing an occasional drone strike. But I think Trump is going to want to do more. He's talked about bombing the hell out of ISIS. If he does that, that will be more American air assets, and that will mean American pilots dying or being taken captive. And it also will risk, bumping up against the Russians. I mean, one of the things that Hillary Clinton was absolutely right about was she was talking about, well, everybody says we should have a no-fly zone in Syria, but here's what that would entail. The first thing you have to do is you have to knock out the Syrian air defenses and probably even a couple of Russian air defenses, and you're going to have a lot of civilians killed, and you're going to have a lot of U.S. Airmen killed. And so Trump, I think, understands the extent of what's going on. He probably has discovered it's more robust than he imagined, but I think his instinct will be to ratchet it up to do more.
I hate to interrupt this conversation, but I have to, unfortunately. Please join me in thanking our panel.